Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing to talk about the rogue weapons, daggers, short swords, and scimitars. These are weapons that are both light and finesse, meaning you can wield one in each hand, and they attack with your dexterity, making them perfect for a rogue, but also for any other character that just wants to make the absolute maximum number of attacks in a round. In part 1 of this video, I covered all the ones available in Act 1, and in part 2, we're going to talk about the ones in Act 2 and Act 3 to give you all of the information to equip your parties for your honor mode builds. In part 1 of the video, I already talked about how we're rating these weapons and the definition of each of the tiers, so go check that out if you haven't yet. But I'm actually recording this after having posted part 1, so I wanted to make a couple updates and corrections based on community feedback. As always, I'm very open to making changes to these lists if people have good arguments as to why I should, and I think there were a couple great points that were raised in the comments, so I want to move a couple items around. The first of these is the steel-forged sword, which is identical to a +1 short sword. It's just a +1 short sword with a guaranteed location. You were all correct that you can get this very early in the game at around the same time when you can get a short sword from a random merchant inventory. So there's no real reason to separate it out, and it should just be S tier, because it's also a +1 short sword that you can get right from the beginning of the game. So we're just going to go ahead and move that there. And secondly, I missed what is perhaps the single most important item in the entire game, everyone's favorite item, the poo scraper. So we're just going to add that one to the list. It's just a normal non-magical dagger with no effects other than just being hilarious, so I'm going to put it in D tier, mostly to generate engagement in the comments because of all the people who will be angry that I didn't give it its own special S+ tier. So those are the two corrections that I want to make, just adding the one very, very important item that I missed, and moving the steel-forged sword to where it belongs in the tier list. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to 0xNaufel for the $10 donation, David Proby for the £2, Tarantula for the $5, and Matt Thompson and Thumb for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support, and it really does mean a lot. Alright, let's talk swords. I'm going to start with a 3-for-1 special, or actually a 6-for-1. The Artificial Leech, the Syringe, and the Trepan all have both non-magical and +1 versions of all of these weapons. All of them are either non-magical or +1 daggers, with the magical versions having various weapon actions available to them, except that those weapon actions are actually not usable by the player. Only the NPCs who spawn equipped with these weapons can use them, so by this point you have all the non-magical and +1 daggers you can eat. You have no need to pick up these weapons, a D tier for all 3 of them. It's really too bad that you can't use these weapon actions, because they'd be kind of cool. Not sure why they restricted it, but since you can't, you can't. Next up, the Justiciar's Scimitar. The Justiciar's Scimitar is a +2 scimitar, so it's one of the more powerfully enchanted weapons that you've found up until this point. And it has a bunch of special effects. Firstly, it replaces the normal scimitar's Lacerate weapon action with Backbreaker. Backbreaker lets you knock down an enemy instead of causing them to bleed, and knocking an enemy prone is much more powerful than causing an enemy to bleed. You can break enemy concentration, you can gain advantage on all of your attacks. It also has the normal flourish attack that lets you get advantage on your next attack, so this weapon could give you advantage with a lot of its weapon actions. And additionally, once per short rest, you can use Shadow-Soaked Blow, which lets you add your proficiency bonus and a d6 of psychic damage to the damage of your attack, which is a pretty decent amount of additional damage. That's either +3 or +4 extra damage at this point in the game, plus an extra d6 of psychic, which then gets doubled if you critically hit. So that's a pretty significant amount of bonus damage for a short rest weapon action. That's just a normal attack, so it's otherwise action economy free. And in addition to that, the attack doesn't break concealment. So if you're hiding, you actually don't lose the hiding status if you attack with the Shadow-Soaked Blow. Now, this I have found to be very, very buggy. It works sometimes and doesn't work other times. And some characters just seem to ignore it. Maybe it has to do with dark vision. Obviously, hiding in Baldur's Gate 3 is a little bit janky at the best of times, so it's not that surprising. Mostly, I wouldn't rely on this weapon action in honor mode, not breaking concealment, because sometimes it just does. But you can still just get a pretty decent amount of extra damage out of it, and it's already on a +2 scimitar, so your damage is pretty reasonable with this weapon already. In addition to all of that, when you hit an enemy with advantage, possibly a prone enemy that you hit with Backbreaker, you have a chance to blind them. So they have a DC 14 con save, or they become blinded, and this is just a passive effect anytime you attack with advantage. Now, one of the best things about blind is it gives you advantage against them, so if you're already finding ways to gain advantage, then you blind them, you gain more advantage. Maybe that's redundant if the way you're getting advantage is the risky ring, but if you're hiding, stealthing up to them, hitting them with Shadow Soaked Blow, maybe you don't even unhide, it's a little bit random, but then you blind them, and then you can continue to wail on them with advantage. So it's a weapon with a bunch of internal synergies as well. Overall, the play pattern with this weapon is just to use its powerful effect to pass out a bunch of free blinds, which is very powerful for a rogue character, and just do a bunch of extra damage once per short rest and knock an enemy prone if they're concentrating on a spell. That's a great weapon. It all comes together in a pretty reasonable package, and for a scimitar user, this is definitely a solid pick. I'm going to put it straight into S tier, because it's a +2 scimitar with a bunch of great effects. Typically, you will pair it with the Knife of the Undermountain King in order to just increase your damage output to maximum at this point in the game. Though there are a couple other options available in Act 2, but this is one of the very best. S tier for the Justiciar Scimitar. The Render of Mind and Body. The Render of Mind and Body is a +1 shortsword, so already on par with a lot of the other weapons we're talking about at this point in the game, that whenever you attack with advantage, deals an extra 1d8 of psychic damage. That's a ton of extra damage if you can consistently trigger it, and the characters that we're talking about who are using this kind of weapon will often be attacking with advantage. This is also around the point in the game where you get access to the Risky Ring and the Gauntlets of the Automaton, ways to just gain permanent advantage for your characters, so you can pretty easily set it up so that you trigger the Render of Mind and Body to be constantly attacking with advantage and constantly applying the extra d8 of psychic damage. Now, it is true that there's a lot of enemies in Act 2 who are immune to psychic damage, but for any enemy that isn't immune to psychic damage, the Render of Mind and Body is going to be absolutely a huge upgrade to your characters, because it's just way more damage than any other weapon up until this point. As long as you can consistently trigger the advantage, this is going to slot in as the best-in-slot damage-dealing weapon alongside the Knife of the Undermountain King, so that will probably be your setup for a big chunk of Act 2 and possibly a big chunk of Act 3 as well. Because this weapon is so powerful, the extra d8 obviously doubles with a crit and all of that stuff, and you're attacking with advantage. So for any character that can trigger the advantage, you're definitely going to use this one. S tier for the Render of Mind and Body. The Ritual Dagger of Shar. The Ritual Dagger of Shar, not to be confused with the Ritual Dagger, despite having the same name, same picture, and same model, is a +1 magical dagger that deals an extra 1d4 of necrotic damage on every attack. Adding extra damage dice to your weapons is one of the most powerful magical effects they can have. Weapons are for doing damage, and extra damage dice are really good. Obviously, they do more damage at base, but also work with your criticals, add on to bonus attacks and everything that you might be making, so the Ritual Dagger of Shar at base is a very solid weapon, because it adds more damage to your attacks. It is worse overall in terms of damage output than the Undermountain King Knife or the Render of Mind and Body, and so characters that can use those weapons and can reliably trigger the advantage for the Render of Mind and Body will prefer that over the Ritual Dagger of Shar. But for a character that can't easily trigger advantage, this is a very powerful weapon. It's also notable as a thrown weapon with extra damage dice attached to it, so you can, if you're not using it as a melee weapon, you can carry it as a backup thrown weapon and get the extra damage dice when you throw it at an enemy. A very useful effect as well. But for the most part, this is just a very solid weapon because it does extra damage. I'm going to give it A tier because it's a little worse than the top tier damage dealing weapons in this act, but still just a very solid weapon that a lot of different characters can use. The Slicing Shortsword. The Slicing Shortsword is a +1 shortsword that whenever you attack with advantage inflicts bleeding on the target. There's no saving throw against this bleed, so you can just attack with advantage. If you hit them, they receive bleeding. That's pretty powerful, because being able to apply bleeding without a saving throw is really good. It can set up con save effects, such as weapon actions, for example. It can also just add bleeding damage for like Tiger Barbarians or characters that care about bleeding or have items that care about bleeding. So just being able to add a no saving throw effect is really nice. Now we are at a part of the game where a lot of enemies are immune to bleeding, but the slicing shortsword will be really helpful for encounters where that is not true for characters that care about bleeding. Bleed builds are pretty powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. Other than the encounters that enemies are immune, they can be really strong, and ways to apply bleeding without a saving throw are always in high demand. So there is a little bit of a narrow circumstance where the slicing shortsword is good. You need to both have a character that inflicts bleeding or cares about bleeding, be fighting an encounter where enemies don't care about bleeding, and not want that character to use a different weapon instead, like the Undermountain King Knife or the Render of Mind and Body. So it's a relatively narrow set of circumstances where the slicing shortsword is good, but it is very good in those circumstances because no saving throw effects are just really, really powerful. So I'm going to give it B tier because there are a lot of other options that will overshadow it for most parties, but for the parties that want the slicing shortsword, it's very, very good. So definitely keep this one in the back of your mind for when you're doing any kind of bleeding synergy with your party. The Sword of Clutching Umbra. The Sword of Clutching Umbra is a +1 short sword that is available right at the beginning of Act 2 and also has the Shadow-Soaked Blow ability of the Justiciar's Scimitar, so it lets you add your proficiency bonus and a d6 of psychic damage once per short rest, and that attack won't break concealment. Unfortunately, even though this is a strictly better +1 short sword, it's also, in my opinion, heavily outclassed by another weapon available at exactly the same point early in Act 2, and not even really that much of an upgrade over the Short Sword of First Blood, if it even is one. So the Sword of Clutching Umbra just is outclassed by the competition available at the point in the game where you can get it, and rarely is going to see play. If you're doing some kind of hiding build specifically and trying to use Shadow-Soaked Blow to get attacks without breaking concealment, and if you find that that works for you consistently, then it could be kind of cool, but otherwise there's not much place for this weapon because there are just other better weapons available at exactly the same point in time. I'll give it C tier for potential hiding builds. The Sword of Lifestealing. The Sword of Lifestealing is a +2 short sword, available at the same point early in Act 2 from the same merchant that the Sword of Clutching Umbra is available, which is why I say the Sword of Clutching Umbra isn't very useful, because the Sword of Lifestealing just fully blows it out of the water. The Sword of Lifestealing is a +2 weapon, so already an awesome upgrade to a lot of the weapons that we might be using at this point in the game, and on a critical hit, it does 10 extra necrotic damage, and gives you 10 temporary hit points. The temp HP are very useful for the squishy type of character that tends to use this type of weapon, and we will also likely be critically hitting very frequently. The most likely weapon to pair this with is the Knife of the Undermountain King, which makes us more likely to critically hit regardless, and characters that use this weapon type will tend to build for critical chance. As you go throughout Act 2, there's more gear that increases your critical hit chance as well, so that effect will start going off more and more often. Now, a lot of the enemies that we face in this act are immune to the extra necrotic damage, but this is still an extremely powerful weapon. The basic question is it more or less damage on average than the Render of Mind and Body? And as long as you can consistently trigger advantage, the extra d8 for the Render of Mind and Body will, on average, I think, beat out the Sword of Lifestealing's critical damage, until you get a bunch more critical hit chance. Once your critical hit chance reaches, critting on a 15 or so, the Sword of Lifestealing will become better again in terms of its damage output. Either way, this is a huge upgrade to your weapon set available right at the beginning of the act. Is going to stay relevant. You might swap it in and out with the Render of Mind and Body. You might use both of them if the Knife of the Undermountain King has another home on an Archer or Warlock or something. So this weapon will definitely see play if you have a character that attacks with this weapon type. S tier for the Sword of Lifestealing. The Sylvan Scimitar. The Sylvan Scimitar is a +1 scimitar that, rather than using your strength or dexterity for attack and damage, uses your casting modifier. So if you're, for example, a druid, then you will roll your normal attack and add your wisdom to attack and damage, rather than your strength or dexterity with this item. The description of the item says it only works on attacks, but it works on both attack and damage, basically letting you pretend to be a Pact of the Blade Warlock or a druid who's cast Shillelagh on any character, not just those characters, and attack using your casting modifier. That's obviously quite useful for any spellcaster that wants to make weapon attacks as well, without having to invest significant amounts into having the stats to do that with. And so that can really let you diversify your builds by making weapon attacks with your casters. You could have a high charisma paladin use this to still make attacks using its charisma, and then have good saving throws and save DCs on your spells while still hitting for your smites. Or a sword blade, a College of Swords bard that wants to cast sword bard spells but also make weapon attacks can use this to have maxed out charisma and make attacks using that. Now, there's two things holding this weapon back. One, it's not that good a weapon in and of itself. It's a +1 scimitar, so it's definitely just a worse weapon than a lot of other weapons available. And two, there's a lot of other ways to sort of duplicate this effect in Baldur's Gate 3. The Gloves of Dexterity let you attack with any weapon using high dexterity without having put any points in dexterity. Elixirs of Giant Strength let you just use any strength weapon on a caster. So only some characters can benefit from this at all if they aren't using those items to just replace their stats and have good combat stats regardless, and they need to have a high casting stat. It's also worth noting this uses your item casting stat, so you can mess it up by multiclassing. You can end up having it use the wrong attribute to attack with, which is kind of annoying. You have to plan your build around using this item. This item is a powerful and unique effect. Not totally unique. There's one other way to get it in the game. But it is a relatively weak version of that effect because the item itself is not particularly powerful. So you can build your character around this, but for the most part, you're better off just using Gloves of Dexterity or using an Elixir of Giant Strength, unless you're doing a particular themed build with the Sylvan Scimitar. This enables some cool off-meta stuff and lets you do some neat builds, so I'm going to give it B tier. But for the most part, this effect is better duplicated in Baldur's Gate, just using the broken items that replace your physical attributes with higher numbers, and then you can just attack with any weapon you want and not be stuck with a sort of mediocre scimitar. The Thorn Blade. The Thorn Blade is a pretty cool weapon, honestly. It's a +1 scimitar that has two special effects. The first is it lets you cast Ensnaring Strike, the level 1 ranger spell, once per long rest, which obviously is not very exciting at this point in the game. But the second is that while you're concentrating on a spell, all your melee weapon attacks deal an extra d4 of poison damage. There's a couple neat things about this effect. Firstly, it's all your melee weapon attacks, not just those from the Thorn Blade. So you can use this in your offhand, concentrate on a spell, and have your main hand weapon deal the extra d4 of poison damage on all your attacks. So if you're a character that makes a lot of main hand attacks, this can basically be like an extra pair of a lesser Infernal Gauntlets, for example, dealing just extra d4s of damage on every attack. And secondly, the Thorn Blade is, I think, still acquirable in multiples. It's one of those items that shows up multiple times in the merchant's inventory, so Damon can just keep having new copies of it whenever you go back and see him. And if you have two of them equipped, they buff each other, so then each of them will be doing an extra 2d4 of poison damage. That's kind of a neat setup, so for a character that can use that with a concentration spell to just deal an extra damage, it's pretty great. If you have the ability to reliably concentrate on something, and pretty much every character does, then this is just a lot of extra damage for your weapon setup. It's a little bit worse overall than the top tier damage weapons that we've talked about already, the Render of Mind and Body, Sword of Life-Stealing, Justiciar Scimitar, but makes a cool alternative to them. You can use a double setup with it. It also has some synergy, of course, if you're doing extra poison damage stuff. And so the Thorn Blade definitely has its place in a bunch of sort of slightly more off-the-wall builds, but you can definitely build around triggering this to deal poison synergy or buff up your main hand weapon by concentrating on a spell. A tier for the Thorn Blade because it just does a reasonable version of its effect, slightly worse than weapons that just do more damage, but pretty cool overall. And finally, for Act 2, the +2 weapons, the generic +2 dagger, shortsword, and scimitar. I'm going to mention here, the only guaranteed locations I know to find these are in Act 3, though if you know of one in Act 2, definitely let me know. But I believe they can show up in merchant inventories as random items, starting at level 9, just like the other +2 weapons. So you may start encountering them in Act 2 or even Act 1, I guess, if you really grind experience. There's basically no reason to buy these generic versions of the powered up weapons. At this point in the game, you have guaranteed more powerful +2 weapons on all of them. At least the Knife of the Undermountain King and the Sword of Lifestealing will be available by the time you see these weapons at all. So there's just no reason to ever buy them. I guess if you have a party that is entirely using this weapon type, then you might make your way down through all of the better weapons to the +2 short sword. So, maybe I could give that C tier, but honestly, I think you can just pretty much ignore these generic +2s. Magical effects are just way better at this point in the game, so you just don't need these. So, at the end of Act 2, you've gotten pretty significant upgrades to your weapons here. Act 2 is actually awesome for rogue weapons. We get a lot of really good additions. It's not like bows, where we didn't get a real upgrade for all of Act 2, basically. But Act 2 for daggers, short swords, and scimitars has a ton of great options. You will likely still be using the Knife of the Undermountain King. It's just that powerful. Increased critical hit chance is really good. But it's also possible that you've got this weapon on like an archer or something and need other short swords for your short sword user. And so the basic choice will be whether you're using the Justiciar's Scimitar to debuff enemies. If you have a character that does a lot of debuffs, you'll be using that one. The Render of Body and Mind for the most possible damage if your character gets lots of advantage, or the Sword of Lifestealing for the most possible damage if either you don't have reliable advantage or your critical hit chance is really, really excellent. Some interesting alternatives that we've got in Act 2, of course, the Ritual Dagger of Shar. This honestly is a little aggressive of an A-tier item, to be frank, but I think it does deserve its place because it does a decent amount of damage as an offhand attack and is a good alternative throwing weapon as well, so it's just useful to have around. And the Thorn Blade, which can do some cool setups, and then a couple others which are useful for specific builds. Alright, let's talk Act 3. First up in Act 3, Ambusher. Ambusher is a +1 short sword, so it's a little bit worse at making weapon attacks than the other weapons that we already have available, but it has some passive magical effects. Ambusher gives you +1 to your initiative, and honestly I could probably stop the review there. You know how I feel about initiative, and this is passive initiative that works just when you're holding this weapon at all. So almost any character can make use of this. An archer can get +1 initiative by holding the ambusher, a spellcaster can get +1 initiative while holding the ambusher. You can combine it with the Knife of the Undermountain King to have 2 passive effects on your weapons for a spellcaster or an archer in order to gain the maximum benefit from your weapon slots by just having one in each hand. You also get advantage on perception checks, less powerful but still moderately useful. And all of your weapon attacks deal an extra d6 necrotic damage against any enemy that hasn't taken a turn yet. That means that for an archery character, this gives you +1 to your initiative and a d6 damage on all of your attacks against enemies at the beginning of combat. If you're like an assassin rogue, then you guarantee those critical hits because they haven't taken a turn yet, and then that extra d6 of damage gets doubled. So that's a ton of damage for a weapon slot that you otherwise have no use for on characters that want the Ambusher. Ambusher is awesome for spellcasters, awesome for archers especially, but also not even terrible for 2-weapon fighters. You probably prefer extra damage, but maybe you're struggling with initiative, and Ambusher can just fix that, as well as not reducing your damage output by too much. This item is just a huge stat stick that doesn't take a slot, so it's just totally free value for the characters that want it, and of course is going straight to S tier. Belm. Belm will be instantly recognizable to people who played Baldur's Gate 2 as one of the best in-slot weapons from that game for a lot of characters, so let's see if it holds up to its reputation. Belm is a +2 scimitar that has 2 additional magical actions. Firstly, whirlwind attack, letting you attack every enemy in an AoE around you once per short rest, which is pretty useful. It's just more attacks, and more attacks are always good. And secondly, perfectly balanced strike, which basically lets you make a main hand attack as a bonus action. So you just get to make an extra attack as a bonus action. Belm is pretty useful in this regard if you are actually not dual wielding it. If you're wielding Belm with a shield, for example, then this lets you make a bonus action offhand attack without actually having to have two weapons equipped. So you can benefit from the benefits of being a two-weapon fighter without needing to two-weapon fight. For most characters, I think if you are planning to be a sword and board style one-handed weapon and shield, there are better options than Belm, but this does let you make a bunch of extra attacks for that kind of character. For a two-weapon fighter, it's also kind of interesting, because if you equip it in the offhand, the bonus action attack, Perfectly Balanced Strike, uses your main hand weapon. So basically, you use Belm as sort of a passive weapon, and then you can make an extra attack with your main hand weapon. So if you have a really good main hand weapon that you just want to make an extra bonus action attack with, Belm can give that to you. There's a couple cool things that you can do with this item, but other than that, it's just a generic +2 scimitar. And that's just worse overall at dealing damage than a lot of the other weapons that we have available at this point in the game. So, except for characters that are planning to make use of the additional bonus action attacks because they're a sword and board character, in which case there are just better one-handed weapons than these light weapons, I just don't think that Belm really has a huge place in the game. I'm going to give it B tier because I think there are cool things that you can do with this weapon, but unfortunately, for an item of such legendary lineage, I just don't think it quite matches up to the reputation that it carries over from previous games, because the effect just isn't something that the characters who can use this weapon or particularly want. The extra bonus action attack is just worse than other options available to sword and board characters in their weapons, and two-weapon fighters just have better slots to fill their two weapons with than this weapon that doesn't give you that much. It's a little sad. I'm kind of disappointed to be putting it in B tier, but I gotta tell the truth to the internet. Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst is a legendary weapon. It's part of a set of 2 legendary weapons from this weapon category, and it has different effects depending on if it's in your main hand or in your offhand. Firstly, it's a +2 dagger, which is already not a terrible thing to be. And then no matter what hand you're wielding it in, you get improved critical, giving you an extra bonus to your critical hit chance. That'll stack with other sources of critical hit chance. So if you have this in your, if you have this and the Knife of the Undermountain King equipped, you get a +2 to your chance to critical hit, or need to roll 2 lower on the die to critical hit. And that's obviously really, really good already for any character that's making weapon attacks, especially for archers, because then you can just boost their crit chance using a weapon slot they weren't otherwise using. In addition to that, in your main hand, if you hit an enemy with this dagger, it inflicts piercing vulnerability on them, which doubles the damage that you're going to do with all the piercing weapons in this weapon category, which is incredibly strong. Piercing vulnerability is insanely powerful, and there's no saving throw against this effect. Now, it is true that this is a little bit redundant with the ballast armor, but if you have the Bloodthirst and don't have the ballast armor, being able to inflict piercing vulnerability with this will double the damage, effectively, of any 2-weapon fighting character, and so that is a massive bonus to those characters. In your offhand, you get +1 to your armor class, and if an enemy misses you with an attack, you get to use your reaction to attack them back and cast True Strike on yourself, so you get to attack them back with advantage. You also get to cast True Strike once per short rest with this weapon, which is kind of a meme, and it's a bound weapon, so it'll come back to you when thrown. But basically the question is, are you getting improved crit and piercing vulnerability, or improved crit and increased armor class, as well as the return strike? For the most part, I think this is better as a main hand weapon, because vulnerability is so broken, but you'd use it as an offhand weapon if either you're going for just the passive benefits of the weapon, because then you get the armor class as well, or if you already have piercing vulnerability from the ballast armor. All of this is to say that this weapon is broken no matter whether you use it as a weapon you're attacking with, or just as a stat stick. +1 to your armor class and +1 to your critical hit chance is awesome for an archer or any character that just benefits from the passive bonuses of this weapon, and it just makes a best-in-slot damage weapon in the late game. The pair of legendary weapons that go together, they go together well, and that's probably what your character with this weapon setup is going to end up using in the late game, so Bloodthirst, of course, is going straight into S tier. Next up, Cold Snap. Now, I'm going to admit right off the start that this is something of a pet item of mine. I really like this item, and I really like trying to make builds that make it work, because it's just so cool. Cold Snap gives you the same +1 to your armor class when wielded in your offhand that Bloodthirst does. So any character could carry this as just a passive stat stick in order to boost their armor class by 1. But of course, you know what else boosts your armor class when wielded in your offhand? A shield. So only characters without shield proficiency would be able to make use of Cold Snap's passive benefits, and those characters may prefer to carry a staff or something as their melee weapon, rather than have to dual wield something with Cold Snap to get +1 armor class. So, for the most part, that passive benefit is not going to come up unless you're actively using the other effect of the weapon. The other effect of Cold Snap is that when an enemy misses you with the Cold Snap, misses you when you have Cold Snap equipped, they become chilled. Chilled is sort of like wet. It gives you vulnerability to cold damage, so they'll take double damage from cold, including the extra d4 of cold damage that the Cold Snap does, and resistance to fire damage. But if you hit them with the wet effect, so if you get water on them, they become frozen and become stunned for a turn. There's a couple ways to break out of frozen, but this is a no saving throw stun. It takes a little bit of work to set up, but if they miss you with an attack when you have Cold Snap equipped, they become chilled, and then you can just cast Create Water on them for a no saving throw stun effect on almost any enemy in the entire game. That's pretty cool on a high AC character, though admittedly, without a shield, high armor class is a little harder to get, but the Cold Snap can really help you to set up a bunch of extra cool effects. Giving enemies vulnerability to cold damage, of course, is also just very good. You have a cold damage dagger equipped with the Cold Snap, and so I think there's a lot of neat, viable builds that you can make around Cold Snap. It's a moderately powerful item as your offhand item, but also just a very cool item that I really like to build around. Do I recommend trying to build around Cold Snap? Honestly, not really. For me, this is kind of a pet item that I'm always trying to work with. But it does require enemies to actually get to attack you in order to gain the most significant benefits of it. So I'm going to give it B tier because it enables some cool off-the-wall strategies, but isn't something that is going to be a mainstay of your most usual honor mode setups. The Crimson Mischief. The Crimson Mischief is the other of the two legendary weapons that's paired with the Bloodthirst. You get them at the same time, and they're sort of intended to be used as a set. The Crimson Mischief is a +2 Shortsword, so a d6 +2 damage, +2 to hit, that also adds a d4 of necrotic damage to your attacks, so already a really good damage item even before we get to the passive benefits that this weapon provides. Firstly, no matter what hand you use it in, and just like Bloodthirst, it has different effects whether you wear it in your main hand or offhand, the Crimson Mischief gets an extra d4 damage against enemies with 50% HP or lower. So you can lower enemy HP by stabbing them with your other weapon and then deal a ton of extra damage with the Crimson Mischief. Pairs very well with the vulnerability you can inflict with Bloodthirst. Use the Bloodthirst attacks to get the enemy down to half HP, and then hit them when they're vulnerable to piercing damage with Crimson Mischief for even more damage output. Then, if the weapon is in your main hand, whenever you make an attack with advantage, you add 7 piercing damage to that attack. This won't get doubled because on a critical hit or anything like that, but just +7 damage whenever you attack with advantage is enormous. Or if it's in your offhand, whenever you make an attack with your offhand weapon, you add your ability modifier to your attack. So the ability modifier damage, this will be your dexterity, is usually going to be 5 or 6. Maybe 4 if you're using the Gloves of Dex. So it'll be a little less than the +7 that you get from the attacks with advantage overall, but still a pretty decent amount of additional damage. The main question, if you're using this weapon paired with Bloodthirst, is which goes in the main hand, which goes in the offhand. You have to either choose between vulnerability from Bloodthirst and slightly less damage from Crimson Mischief, or more damage from Crimson Mischief and the counterattacks from Bloodthirst. The answer basically is if you have the ballast armor for damage vulnerability, then you use Bloodthirst in your offhand, Crimson Mischief in your main hand. But if you don't, then you want your Bloodthirst in your main hand to inflict vulnerability, and Crimson Mischief in your offhand. Weirdly, without the ballast armor, you end up using the short sword in your offhand and the dagger in your main hand, which is kind of a funny setup. But that's how it works without additional sources of vulnerability. The Crimson Mischief, unlike the Bloodthirst, isn't really a super powerful passive stat stick for like an archer. You wouldn't just wear it, but there is one interesting use case, which is that the offhand weapon attacks from Crimson Mischief, the effect that lets you add your dex to damage again, works on any offhand weapon attacks. So if you have Crimson Mischief equipped in your offhand and 2 hand crossbows, then you get to add extra damage to your offhand hand crossbow attacks. So it can be a good stat stick for them as well. Either way, this weapon is going to be really, really powerful. Just a ton of damage. It's one of the highest damage output weapons in the entire game. You pair it with Bloodthirst for massive damage. Just the sheer amount of extra damage it adds on every attack is really, really good. And so it's best in slot for this type of character. S tier for Crimson Mischief. The Dolor Amarus. The Dolor Amarus is a +2 dagger with the passive effect of whenever you critical hit an enemy, it deals 7 extra damage, just a flat 7 extra damage. This works regardless of what you attack with. It has to be a weapon or unarmed strike, not a spell, but does not have to be the actual Dolor Amarus weapon. So you can use this alongside a bow to deal 7 extra damage with your critical strikes, or alongside another weapon in your main hand to deal 7 extra damage with your critical strikes, or even alongside unarmed attacks to deal extra damage with your critical strikes if you use this as an offhand weapon on a monk. The basic question here is this better than increased critical hit chance? Because it's competing for the slot with the Knife of the Undermountain King, and of course eventually with the Bloodthirst as well. And I think that 7 extra damage on a critical is usually worse than +1 to your critical hit chance, but still pretty good. If you have a build that's getting a lot of critical hits, the Dolor Amarus is going to be good for that build. Just extra damage is really nice, but those builds will typically just want to increase their critical hit chance. The one character that does use this really well is characters that are guaranteeing critical hits on enemies. So assassin rogues, or characters that are using hold person or something to guarantee critical hits, then just having your crits do extra damage is really good. Though it's not necessarily that much better than just adding damage dice, but it often shows up in a weapon slot that you're not otherwise using. I'm going to give the Dolor Amarus A tier, because most characters that would want it would prefer increased critical hit chance, but it's very, very good on characters that guarantee critical hits, and so some builds will still prefer this over the increased crit chance weapons in S tier. The Dread Iron Dagger. The Dread Iron Dagger is a +1 dagger that, when you are hidden, deals an extra d6 necrotic damage. This isn't even particularly better than the Ritual Dagger of Shar that we already have. I mean, it's a d6 damage, but only for the first attack in combat. Maybe could be used with greater invisibility, but just generally speaking is not going to be a bunch of additional damage, and of course is vastly outclassed by the other weapons that we have at this point in the game. No point in using this item, D tier. The Fleshrender. The Fleshrender is a +2 shortsword with a short rest weapon action that lets you add your proficiency bonus in necrotic damage and force an enemy to make a con save or become unable to heal or gain temp HP for 3 turns. Preventing enemies from healing does have some applications in some combats. This, for the most part, is just a worse weapon than the other weapons that we have available, though, so it will very rarely see play. I might give it C tier just because there are some fights where enemies heal a ton, and maybe this is your best way to prevent that from happening. You can give them reduction on the con save and stuff like that. If they're not if they're undead, then you can stop them from healing with Bone Chill, but there are fewer ways to stop non-undead enemies from healing, so maybe the Fleshrender has application in like 1 or 2 encounters. I'll give it C tier just in case, though honestly you can probably forget about this item. The Gleamdance Dagger. The Gleamdance Dagger is a +2 dagger with a 20-foot light radius, which obviously you can duplicate with a cantrip, and when it's in your offhand, you gain a +1 to your armor class. It doesn't have any other effects, and if you want a +1 to your armor class in your offhand, shields exist, so this would only be useful for a character without shield proficiency. And for that use case, the Cold Snap is available earlier and is just better because it also gives you the chill when an enemy misses. It would be a very bizarre party that wanted 2 of that effect, and having a strictly better version of such a narrow effect makes the Gleamdance Dagger basically useless. D tier, I just don't see any reason to use this over Cold Snap if that's what you want. the Kurwin's Cauteriser. Kurwin's Cauteriser is a +1 scimitar that also deals an extra d4 of fire damage, so on every single attack, and when you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a con save or they get lit on fire and become burning. A +1 scimitar with an extra d4 of fire damage isn't awful at this stage in the game, but certainly falls behind the other damage weapons we have available, so only if you particularly care about lighting enemies on fire, if you have some sort of synergy with burning enemies, then Kurwin's Cauteriser is actually a pretty good way to light enemies on fire, because you can do it on every attack. It is also a way to pass out a condition with every single attack, so if you care about passing out conditions, maybe it can be useful. And it's extra fire damage, so you could use it with the Hat of Fire Acuity. There's a couple synergy things, but for the most part, this item is not going to be particularly useful, because it's just a +1 sword in Act 3, and that just makes it significantly less valuable to have overall. I'm going to give it C tier, because there are some neat synergies, and it's not awful, but it's not very good. The Murderous Cut. The Murderous Cut is a +1 dagger that deals an extra d4 of piercing damage against enemies with half HP or lower. I mean, if you want a +1 dagger that deals an extra d4 of damage, the Ritual Dagger of Shar just does that better. It is piercing damage, which is like mildly relevant, but this is outclassed by an itself already well outclassed item, so the Murderous Cut is never going to see use. D tier. Rhapsody. Rhapsody is a fascinating weapon that's going to annihilate game balance on whatever character you put it on. It's a +1 dagger, but that's not the important part. The important part is that every time you kill an enemy, you gain a stacking +1 bonus to your attack rolls, damage, and spell save DC up to a maximum of +3, which doesn't go away, so you're just going to have a +3 bonus to all of your attacks, save DC, and damage when you have this weapon equipped. In addition to that, when you have 3 stacks, you can, as a bonus action, consume them for an emergency heal, a guaranteed critical hit, or to give enemies disadvantage on your saving throws. So you can spend this bonus in order to just obliterate one enemy with a guaranteed critical, or lock them down with a spell. For the most part, you won't be doing this, because a +3 bonus on everything is just too valuable to spend. But the Rhapsody bonus is ridiculous whether you use it or not. This works as a passive weapon, so it's going to power up your hit chance if you have it equipped as an archer. It's going to power up your save DC if you have it equipped on a spellcaster. And, of course, it will work if you are actually making attacks with it. If you do make attacks with it, it can cause enemies to bleed, but again, not the important part of the weapon. The important part is the just gigantic passive bonus that you get. This is one of the ultimate stat stick items in the game. It just increases your stats wildly. It's actually not quite as good, in my opinion, if you're attacking with it, though still probably best in slot. You would probably use either Bloodthirst or Crimson Mischief and Rhapsody, but another character in your party is most likely going to claim this weapon because it powers up spellcasters and archers so dramatically that it is going to just make those characters incredibly powerful without even spending any resources, because they don't have to use a slot that they're otherwise really using on holding this weapon. Best in slot as a stat stick for other characters, the Rhapsody, of course, is S tier. And again, +3 to everything for free is just so far over the normal game balance curve that the Rhapsody just is wildly overpowered and makes your characters incredibly strong. Incredible item, will make your honor mode runs way easier if you use it. S tier. The Salty Scimitar. The Salty Scimitar. The Salty Scimitar is a +2 scimitar that lets you cast Command once per long rest as a level 1 spell, so you can command one creature. It's basically a generic +2 scimitar, and a generic +2 scimitar just isn't very good at this point in the game. Though, I will say that this is an S tier item for multiplayer, because every time you attack with it, you get to yell, "I'm attacking with my Salty Scimitar!" And your buddies just have to deal with that. So, your mileage may vary on how much you want to do that, but the actual weapon effects of this weapon are not particularly good. D tier, but very hilarious. And finally, for Act 3 weapons, the Stillmaker. The Stillmaker is a +2 dagger that lets you cast Hold Person at level 3 once per long rest. This is a slightly more interesting spell to cast than the command that the Salty Scimitar gives you, because it targets 2 creatures, so you can lock down 2 enemies since it's a 3rd level spell, and saves you a 3rd level spell slot. It's also hold person, so if you land it and then attack the enemy that you held personed, then you will get automatic critical hits against them. So there's some synergy with the weapon. That being said, basically this is an item that makes you use a worse weapon in order to save a spell slot, and you could just use a scroll, or at this point in the game you have lots of ways to restore spell slots, so it mostly doesn't have usage. But if you're doing like a specific challenge run without scrolls, or really, really long adventuring days, then maybe the extra spell cast could come in handy, so I'll give it C tier for that reason. But again, this one is fairly safe to ignore in most circumstances. So, at the end of Act 3, if you have a 2-weapon fighting character, they're almost certainly using the Bloodthirst and the Crimson Mischief. This legendary weapon set is intended to be the best in slot 2-weapon fighting set, and it pretty much is. For this type of character, it's hard to do better, provided that you have another character that needs Rhapsody. Rhapsody is actually best not on 2-weapon fighting characters, but it's just a totally busted weapon. So if you don't have an archer or spellcaster who can benefit from Rhapsody, your 2-weapon fighting character will be subbing it in. Whether you sub it in for Bloodthirst or Crimson Mischief will depend on whether you're using the Ballast armor for that character as well. If you aren't, then you need Bloodthirst for piercing vulnerability. If you are, then you'll use Rhapsody and Crimson Mischief plus the Ballast armor to take out your enemies. Other characters in your party will very likely be using the Ambusher and the Knife of the Undermountain King, possibly Dolor Amarus, possibly Bloodthirst if you don't have a 2-weapon fighting character, because these are all hugely powerful passive benefits that your characters can make use of, whether or not they're intending to 2-weapon fight. So this weapon category has a lot of weapons that give you awesome passive benefits. Rhapsody, Bloodthirst, Ambusher, Knife, and Dolor are all amazing passive benefits, so a lot of your parties are going to end up with every character, or like 3 of your characters, carrying 2 swords while they are using their ranged attacks or casting their spells. Unless you actually are a great weapon fighter or need to wear a shield, 2 of these rogue weapons are often the best setup because the passive effects of these weapons are just so incredibly powerful in the late game. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the best rogue weapons in Baldur's Gate 3, the daggers, short swords, and scimitars that can be wielded 1 in each hand. These weapons have some of the most powerful damage setups in the game, but also, of course, some of the most powerful just passive benefits in the game. So every party should look at this weapon category because it's very likely that you have characters that benefit from the passives, even if you don't have a character that's actively set up to use this weapon category. As always, if you think that I've misplaced something here and want me to make a change, move an item around, I'm definitely open to do that. If you have good arguments as to why, please leave them in the comments, and we will revisit if I think that there's something that I messed up on or missed a cool build with an item. Definitely do let me know. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so of course I really appreciate when people take the time to do that. I say this a bunch, but it is actually the best way to support a creator, is to just interact with the video in some way, because YouTube's algorithm cares about that a lot. Second, I guess, to the actual best way to support a creator, which is to give me money if you are so inclined, and if you feel that generous, then of course I appreciate the people who do that very, very much. Alright, my friends, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will catch you next time.